talking about social psychology. Up till now, almost everything we've covered has fallen in the realm of what's called cognitive psychology. So now we're shifting to kind of a different subfield of psychology. And this is, a whole subfield. If you go to a four-year university, and even some community colleges often will offer an entire class on social psychology. And we're only going to spend today talking about it. So we're just going to kind of briefly go over, I think, some of the interesting topics that you might study if you were to take a social psychology course. But this is really just kind of like a little snapshot of just very briefly, a couple little topics. In general, social psychology really focuses on how an individual's behaviors, their attitudes, their beliefs are affected by the society around them. So it focuses on things like relationships and group dynamics. And so that's kind of like, in general, what the subfield is about. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the, like I said, important topics. We'll talk about things like social media, other types of media like video games and how they affect a person's behavior or attitudes. We'll also, again, talk very briefly about the justice system. We already talked a little bit about, I think, like eyewitness testimony when we talked about memory, because the justice system kind of is in this intersection between social psychology, because it's, a social setting. The whole criminal justice system is a group that affects our behavior. But then there's topics, like memory and attention that falls more in cognitive psychology that also contributes to some of those studies as well. So we'll talk just a little bit more about that. And then we'll end by talking about some of the criticisms against this field. So some of the things I'll talk about in that section are general to not even just psychology, but pretty much any science. All sciences suffer from all kinds of issues that we'll get into. But social psychology in particular has had kind of a lot of crises, I would say, where they've had some unethical things happen. So we'll talk a little bit about what some of those things are and why social psychology in particular is kind of prone to that. So to start, I'm just going to have kind of, like I said, a few little subtopics you would find within social psychology, not necessarily in any particular order. One thing that's often studied in social psychology is what's generally called diffusion of responsibility, which is this idea that whenever we're in a group setting, we tend to act very differently compared to how we would act if we were by ourselves as an individual. And a lot of that is due to this idea that, like, when you're with a group, you can kind of shift some of the blame or responsibility to everyone else in that group instead of taking the blame entirely onto yourself. And there's a couple different versions of what this looks like. To understand just kind of like in general what I mean, I want you to imagine a couple different scenarios. So scenario one, I want you to imagine that you have, let's fast forward, it's Monday, you're supposed to be here for your final exam at 9:15, and let's say it's a class where like exams are the only thing that matters for your grade. Not true of this class, but let's just pretend. Right, so like if you fail this final exam or you miss it, you're going to fail the entire class. So it's super important you get here on time. Let's say you're walking to campus and you get to an intersection and you're by yourself, there's no one else around, it's not busy or anything, and you see a homeless person on the corner and it looks like they're maybe having like a heart attack or some sort of medical emergency. Okay, I want you to just imagine, you don't have to tell me, but imagine what you might do in that scenario. So you have to kind of weigh, like, I need to get to my exam on time, but there's this emergency happening, should I stop and respond? Okay.
Someone else can deal with it.
So you gotta imagine in this key scenario, you're by yourself. There's no cars around, there's nobody else. So, you could choose to walk past and yeah, maybe someone else will come, who knows. But then maybe imagine that exact same scenario, except instead of you're by yourself at that intersection, imagine that it's very busy. And there's 20 other people that are lined up waiting to cross the sidewalk, and they all see the same thing. They see the homeless person on the sidewalk potentially having a heart attack, right? Would that change your response, depending on if you're by yourself or if there's a bunch of other people around you? What most people show, there's actually studies where they've tested that, so they'll have sort of like a Confederate that's pretending to be in some sort of emergency situation on a sidewalk somewhere, and they'll see how many people stop and help, depending on if they're by themselves or if they're in a group. And in general, when people are by themselves, they're more likely to help compared to if there's a large group of people around them. And again, kind of the idea is, well, they think like, if there's 20 other people, somebody else is going to deal with this. I have an exam I need to get to, so I'm going to go ahead and rush away and let someone else handle it. So some other ways that groups can affect our behavior. One is what's called conformity. This is also sometimes called the Asch effect, or there's a very specific kind of conformity called the Asch effect. And that's just named after the researcher who did the study I'm about to describe. So what Asch did is he had participants who were trying to do just a very simple task. They had an image on the screen that had like 4 different lines of different lengths, and they were just supposed to say which one is the longest. So like super easy, anyone who's above like 5 years old should be able to get this thing correct. But what he did is he had a bunch of, again, Confederates. So Confederates are people in an experiment who are sort of acting like they are participants or acting like they're someone else, but they're actually part of the experiment, okay? So he had a group of like, let's say 5 Confederates who all are pretending to also be participants, and he has them answer one at a time, but everybody's like sitting there, they can hear everyone's answer. And the real participant always goes last. So what he did is he had all the 5 Confederates give the wrong answer. And they gave the same wrong answer. So maybe it's like line C is actually the longest one. All 5 of the Confederates would say, no, it's line A is the longest. And what they find is that the majority of people, when they're the actual participant, they will conform and they will give the wrong answer. They will say that line A is the longest when actually it was C, just to go along with whatever the group was saying. So that's called the Asch effect, when we give an obviously wrong answer, or when we do something that's obviously against our own best interests in order to like conform to the people around us. Another version of this is the one I actually just described with the scenario that I gave you to imagine. That's called the bystander effect. So the bystander effect is this effect where if someone needs help, we're typically more likely to help if we're by ourselves or in a very small group. The larger the group gets, the less likely we are to actually help. There's a little bit of controversy about how this finding originally came out. So one of the first kind of cases that triggered the research on this and that kind of coined the term bystander effect was this woman named Kitty Genovese. Do I have in my notes? So it was, I think, like 1930s in New York. Kitty Genovese was basically assaulted in an alleyway. And the kind of interesting thing is this alleyway was surrounded by apartment buildings that all had windows that looked out onto this alleyway. And there were reports at the time that came out afterwards that said that, you know, they estimated that probably like 50 people would have witnessed what was happening in this alleyway, and not a single one of them called the police or did anything to respond. And again, the idea was kind of, well, all these people assumed, you know, there's all these other windows open, there's all these other people watching this happen, so, you know, I'll let someone else deal with it and not take responsibility for myself. So all those headlines and stuff came out in like the 1930s, and then that triggered all this research on the bystander effect. But then later, there were researchers who went back and found that there were a lot of inaccuracies in the way that it was reported, that actually a lot of people did try to call the police, but for some reason their calls weren't going through. So it wasn't necessarily that people weren't taking responsibility, it was more just there was like an error or something going on with the phone lines that particular day. But having said that, there have been studies like I just described where people have actually tested, you know, does this effect happen? And they have found that it does pretty much repeatedly. Again, people tend to take less responsibility if they're in a large group compared to if they're by themselves or in a small group. Another version of this is something called groupthink. So groupthink is basically where you have individuals within a group who are allowed to make decisions. So something like a manager, you know, a leader in a situation. And they tend to ignore the advice of experts for the sake of like keeping everyone in the group happy. Okay, so you have a manager who maybe has to make a tough decision. If they go with what the experts are saying and do what, you know, the science says or what they maybe should do, then it's going to make all these people unhappy, right? So they choose to ignore the experts and go with just whatever's going to keep people positive and moving forward. So one real-life example of this is from the Challenger space shuttle. So you guys might know Challenger space shuttle was like a disastrous failure, basically exploded. Multiple people died as a result of it. I think 7 astronauts died in this accident. And there was a lot of research afterwards to try to figure out what happened. Basically, I don't remember all the details, but like the rocket launched and then exploded before it got very far off the ground. And what they found is that a lot of the issues that caused that explosion, a lot of the engineers had been telling like the managers involved in making the decision of whether they're going to launch or not. A lot of the engineers were telling them, like, there's this issue with, I don't remember what it was, there was like a seal in the fuel tank or something that wasn't like functioning properly. And all the engineers were telling them, like, this is not good, it's probably gonna explode. But if they had stopped the launch, then there were a lot of people who would have been very angry and upset because they had like a lot of, you know, money invested in making sure that this happens at a particular time. So the managers chose to just ignore what their engineers and their experts are saying to try to keep all these people happy. And then as a result, we have this disastrous accident that results in 7 people losing their lives. So that's one very drastic example of groupthink, but again, very common that someone in a leadership position might make decisions to keep everyone happy instead of doing, you know, kind of like the right thing. Another type of this is called social loafing. An example of this, maybe some of you have experienced, would be like a student group project where one person kind of takes on most of the work, does most of the work, and a bunch of other people just kind of, you know, don't really participate or contribute. Again, fairly common that if we take people and put them in a group setting, that they will rely on everyone else to do the work for them instead of taking the responsibility or accountability to do it themselves. And then another one is called de-individuation. This is where when people are in large groups, they tend to do things that they themselves would often consider like immoral or wrong, and that they wouldn't do if they were in an individual setting. So maybe a good example of this would be things like mobs and riots. So you get large groups of people together, they might do things like, you know, break into stores, catch things on fire, flip cars over, things that they would never do if they were just by themselves. And again, usually it's because they feel like being in that group setting kind of like makes them anonymous to some extent. They feel like they're not going to suffer the consequences of it, or at least that if they are going to suffer the consequences, then they're going to have this huge group of people that will suffer the same consequences, so they won't at least be doing it alone. So those are just some examples. Those are all different types of kind of this idea of diffusion of responsibility. I should say, because I don't want to sound super negative, it's not like these things are guaranteed to happen every time you get people in a group. Oftentimes you put people in a group and then you can do like great, amazing work and can kind of, you know, like synergize and help each other. But these are some of the negative things that can happen when you put people in group settings. Okay, another area of research in social psychology that's very active, especially now, is focusing on social media and the impacts that social media has on our lives, which I don't know how much you guys hear about this stuff. I would guess probably a lot. I'll just ask you, how many of you think that using social media frequently is good for you? Okay. How many of you use social media frequently? Yeah, right. Kind of this contradiction we have in our beliefs versus our behavior that's extremely common. So you guys probably know all the stuff I'm about to tell you, but just to kind of like drive it home, using social media, definitely not good for you. And maybe possibly not good for you in ways that you don't even necessarily know about. So this video, very short, this is a guy kind of describing how social media is designed to be addictive by nature. So I'll play this and then we can kind of, I don't know, talk about it, digest a little bit.
One thing we don't talk about is that it's sort of hard to talk about this. Our minds have these kinds of backdoors.
It's from YouTube, so there should how much thought they put into making it addictive. Just to kind of put this in perspective too, so you guys know a little bit more about how these social media companies work. So I got a PhD in cognitive psychology from Iowa State University, and over the time that I was there, I had lots of people in my cohort, other students going through that program. There was probably over the course of the 5 years that I was there was, I don't know, maybe 80 students that went through that whole program. And maybe me and 3 other students ended up going into a job like this, an academic setting. Everyone else that went through that program ended up in what we called industry jobs, which is basically working for places like Facebook, Apple, Google, etc. So people who have the same degree I have, who know all this stuff about how the mind works and the brain works, they go work for these companies to try to basically make these products more addictive and to use our psychology against us, basically. We actually joke, I have friends that are in these industries and we call it the dark side, because everybody kind of jokes about how evil it is, essentially, which it really is if you start to think about it, because the whole point is just for them to make profits off of our addiction to these devices. And probably not surprisingly, use of social media, especially if you use it frequently, is correlated with things like reduced self-esteem and reduced body image. That's particularly true. So some of this kind of depends on how you use social media. So people who use things like Instagram or I don't know, TikTok even, if you follow a lot of things that are focused on superficial stuff like beauty, wealth, etc., then that can often really tank our self-esteem and our body image, because we're constantly comparing ourselves to these impossible standards, right? I'm sure you all know that pretty much anyone who's an influencer who posts on Instagram or TikTok, they're constantly filtering their real image, right? They're doing all kinds of things to make sure that they look the best that they possibly can. They may be using actual filters. Even if they're not using filters, they're often putting a lot of time and effort into doing their makeup just right and taking pictures from just the perfect angle with the perfect lighting. All of that, very different from what we experience in the real world. And so when you're comparing yourself constantly to something like that, it's impossible you're ever going to live up to that standard, right? So then our self-esteem, our body image, tanks. That can lead to all kinds of things like increased rates of depression and anxiety. Can be very negative for our overall mental health. I would say, so oftentimes people who have this discussion, they kind of come to the conclusion we need to get rid of social media. Obviously that's never going to happen, right? I feel like we've reached a point you can't turn back. Everybody loves it and is addicted to it. It's almost impossible to get rid of it. But I think there are healthy ways to use your social media. So there are all kinds of great things on social media, right? There's tips on how to be healthy. There's things that can help you with hobbies, learn how to, garden or crochet or do new skills. And so if you can focus your social media on the things that will help you be the person you want to be, then that might actually, reverse some of these issues. So just something to maybe think about as you're using social media. Maybe try to kind of curate your algorithm, right? So they're using all these algorithms to feed you what you click on. So anything you interact with, you're basically telling Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, whatever, I like this, I want to see more of it. So if you're clicking on the pretty faces and people who have lots of wealth, that's what you're going to get over and over, right? But if you click on the videos that are here's how to garden, or here's how to make bread, or here's how to exercise effectively, or the things you actually want to do, if you sit down and think about what your goals are, then that's what you're going to see more of. That's going to motivate you to be more like that kind of ideal self that you would like to be. So lots of research, though, on social media. I just kind of, again, just barely touched on some of the basics. Any questions about it? Any specific topics in social media you guys would like to know more about? Okay. All right, next topic, very common area of research in social psychology, is the impact of what I would call violent media on our aggressive behaviors. Most of this at this point focuses specifically on video games, but there's also some older research that focuses on things like movies and music. So when I say violent media, I'm talking about anything where there's violence depicted in. So if it's a movie, it's showing things like murder or physical altercations, sexual assaults, things like that. For video games, it's things where the point of the video game or the way that you progress in the video game is by, doing those violent behaviors as the character you're controlling or whatever. And so kind of the main question in this area of research is, does engaging with that kind of media increase your chances of aggressive behavior? And when I talk about aggressive behavior, we can also break that down further. So there's lots of different kinds of aggression. There's things like verbal aggression, right? Like yelling at someone, insulting someone, calling them names. There's physical aggression, fighting someone, pushing someone, etc. So the question is, does using this media lead to higher rates of aggression? And I feel like most people, if you ask them this question, they have this perception that there's a lot of controversy or like a debate within the literature about whether, there is this relationship or not. If you read kind of just like a, mainstream media news article about it, you'll also kind of get this perceived controversy. But if you actually start digging down into the research that's done by social psychologists, you'll find that there's not really a lot of controversy. Most people tend to agree that the more you engage with violent media, the more likely it is that your aggressive behaviors will increase. Okay. Now, that is not saying that there's like this one-to-one, if you use violent video games, you're for sure going to be an aggressive, violent person. It just means that using that kind of media increases your chances. It's like one risk factor that increases your chance of being more aggressive. It's kind of like, sometimes they compare it to like smoking and lung cancer, for example. So we know if you smoke cigarettes, that increases the chance you're going to get lung cancer, but it's not the case that every person who smokes cigarettes will for sure get lung cancer. And there are other things that can cause lung cancer, right? Like you can have environmental toxins, even like genetic predisposition, things like that. So it's kind of similar that, this is one risk factor that increases rates of aggression. So that's the main point I was just making. So we know from lots of different kinds of research that violent media does tend to increase aggression. Just to give you some examples of some of the kinds of research that it's done, there's kind of a broad range. One way of doing this is to look at short-term effects with like laboratory experiments. So there's some experiments where they will have, 100 participants come into their laboratory, 50 of them will play a violent video game. Usually that violent video game is going to be something like a first-person shooter kind of game, where like the whole goal of the game is to go around shooting people. And then you have the other half playing something that is considered a non-violent video game. So they used to do things like Tetris, stuff like that, but they've been more careful now about trying to balance like how engaging is the game, how immersive is it. So they try to find games that are kind of similar in like graphics level and everything to your first-person shooter, but where there isn't any violence in it. And so they have participants play either one of those games for maybe an hour, and then usually what they will do is they'll have, again, a confederate who's kind of part of this study that will be out in the hallway after the participant leaves, and the confederate will intentionally kind of budge into the participant. So they'll be walking down the hall and they'll like shove their shoulder into them. And then they'll measure how many people respond aggressively to that interaction. And what they find is the ones who have just played the violent video game, they're much more likely to yell, to insult, or to get into a physical altercation with the confederate compared to the ones who played the non-violent video game. Okay? So lots of experiments that are kind of set up with that same premise or that same kind of, setup. So we know, like in the short term, if you've just played a violent video game, you're more likely to kind of be aggressive immediately after that. There are also what are called longitudinal studies, where they track people from an early age, and they kind of survey them maybe every year to try to figure out how much video games are you playing in general, how much of those video games are violent, and then what kind of aggressive behaviors have you displayed? Have you been sent to the principal's office because you got in a fight? Have you been arrested for some sort of physical violence? And again, there they find, even those longitudinal studies, that people who play lots of violent video games tend to have more aggressive behaviors in real life as well. I would say, so again, other things that contribute to aggression are things like, if you're abused as a child, if you see other people being aggressive frequently, like your parents fight aggressively, if you are, if you have substance abuse disorder. So there's all these other factors that contribute to aggression. Playing violent video games or having violent media is just one of them. Having said all of that, I love video games. I play aggressive video games sometimes, so it's not It's not like I'm trying to demonize them or make it sound like they're the worst thing ever. Again, it's just kind of something to be aware of, that it can be one of several risk factors that contribute to aggressive behavior. Any questions about that? All right. I think this is the last kind of topic before we get into some of the issues with social psychology. So we talked, like I said, about justice system stuff a few weeks ago. There we specifically talked about like the role of memory in eyewitness testimony. I want to talk here more about interrogations. So interrogations are where typically you have like a suspect, so someone that the police believe who has committed a crime, and they're going to bring them in to question them to try to see if they can, poke holes in their alibi, see if maybe they can get them to confess to the crime. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about an interrogation. And so, again, social psychologists, one of the big areas that they study is in the justice system. Things like eyewitness testimony, we already talked about, interrogations, how people behave on a trial, in a jury, etc. So one of the areas of focus in this kind of subfield is trying to identify like best practices for police to follow, and trying to do that through like a scientific method. So use the scientific method to try to figure out what kinds of interrogation techniques are actually effective, which ones are not. So in the US, many police precincts train their officers to interrogate using something called the Reid technique. And again, I believe Reid technique is named after the person who designed it. I think that's where that comes from. This technique was created in the 1950s, so it's pretty old, but it's still followed, like I said, by a lot of police precincts today. And essentially, this technique, the spoiler of what I'm about to tell you is that this technique is not very effective. One thing it is good at is getting false confessions. So people who go through the Reid technique are more likely to falsely say that they committed a crime that they actually did not, compared to some other interrogation techniques we'll talk about in just a second. So kind of the way that this Reid technique works, first of all, the entire point of the interview, it's kind of set up as what's called an accusatory process. So kind of the whole thing underlying the Reid technique is that you're bringing the suspect in, you're assuming that they're guilty, and all the questions and interactions are based around trying to get them to confess to the crime, okay? So typically what police will do using this technique, they'll first start by asking the suspect some baseline questions that they know the truth about already. So they might, ask them what's their name, what's their occupation, etc. Just kind of some like baseline stuff. And the goal of that first part is for the cop to kind of gauge what this suspect looks like when they're telling the truth. So that they then can use that to help them identify when the suspect is lying later in the rest of the interrogation. Now I should say there's been lots of studies done on testing how good cops are at detecting if someone is lying. How good do you guys think? If you took a cop and you tested them on their ability to detect a lie, yes, yeah. So it turns out cops are no better than the general population at detecting lies. And that number of how good we all are at detecting lies is chance levels. So if I record, for example, I record a video of me telling a story that's totally truthful, I record a video of me telling a story that's completely made up and a lie, and I play you those two videos, and I ask you to figure out which one is the lie, you will be able to do it at chance levels, meaning 50% of the time you'll be correct, right? You get a 50-50 chance you're going to get the right one because there's only two options. So if I tested all of you, especially if I did that 100 times with different videos back to back, you'd be about 50% performance. And cops are exactly the same, right? They can judge if someone's lying at about chance levels. And the reason is because a lot of the things that we think of as indicating that someone is lying is not accurate, right? So what are some things that you've been told you should look for if you're trying to figure out if someone's lying or not?
Lack of eye contact.
Yeah, so fidgeting, lack of eye contact. Any others? Maybe sweating or appearing nervous, right? But if you've just been arrested for a crime and you're being accused of that crime, do you think you're going to be a little nervous? You think you're gonna be fidgety? You think you're gonna be happy to make eye contact with this cop that's like yelling at you and accusing you of something? Like, no. So no one, especially in an interrogation setting, is going to look normal. They're gonna have some abnormal behaviors, and none of that is going to indicate very well whether you're lying or not. So cops often rely on those tells, but they don't work very well. So that's why they're not very good at it, because they're using the wrong thing to try to figure out if someone's lying or not. But again, the whole idea of that first stage is let's try to figure out what this person looks like when they're telling the truth, and then we can tell when they're lying, right? And even if you break down that logic, right, a lot of their baseline questions are like easy things. What's your name? What's your occupation? I'm not going to be nervous telling someone I'm a professor and my name's Larissa or whatever, right? But if they ask me, oh, well, where were you on the night of this murder? Then all of a sudden, like, that's a very nervous-making question, right? This is going to make me very nervous. So probably my behavior is going to change when I'm answering that question, regardless of whether I'm telling the truth or not. Okay, so they start by that. They are allowed to lie about having evidence. So usually the next step is to tell the suspect, we know you did this crime because we have this piece of evidence, or because we have this witness that said that you did it. We have your fingerprints at the crime or whatever. So then that puts the person in a very weird position where it's like suddenly you have to try to explain this piece of evidence that's made up, that's not even real, right? And like that's going to be very difficult to describe. So again, you might stumble over your words. You might appear nervous, which they may think as lying. They will do this tactic where they try to get the person to confess by shifting blame away from them, by saying like, okay, I know you maybe committed this crime, but obviously you did it because you're under stress because of whatever else is happening. Or you did it because your friend coerced you to do it or whatever. So they try to kind of shift blame away so that the person doesn't feel as bad about whatever the crime is that they're suspected of doing. They're trained to minimize any opportunity for the suspect to deny. So if the suspect starts to say, no, I didn't do it, then the cops are supposed to kind of cut them off there and not let them proceed with whatever they're saying. They also often sometimes will offer these like two alternatives of like the version of how the crime happened. So one version makes it sound like the suspect is just this horrible, evil person who did the crime because they love doing crime because they're evil. And then the second version is like, okay, well maybe you did it because you're trying to help out your family or your whatever, like this more socially acceptable version. But in both versions, they're admitting to having done the crime, right? So either if they pick option A or option B, they're still confessing to having done a crime that they may not have done. So that's kind of the gist of, what's used in the Reid technique. Again, that's often like police officers in some precincts are trained to follow this. So it's not very effective at getting the truth. It's not very effective at getting extra information that might help the investigation. And it is more likely, like I said, to lead to false confessions because oftentimes the person in the situation feels extremely pressured because sometimes too they will offer, some sort of like plea deal. Like, okay, if you confess to this, we'll reduce your sentence or we'll whatever. So people in that situation often feel like, okay, they're saying they have evidence that proves I was there. If I don't confess to this crime, then I'm going to end up in prison for 20 years. If I confess to doing this crime, even though I know I didn't do it, then I'm only going to be in prison for 5 years or whatever. So they end up confessing a lot of times, even if they've never actually committed the crime. Another approach is, there's like alternatives. We don't have to do it this way because there's lots of other ways you could do it. One is called the peace approach that's used in England and like throughout the UK. And the focus of this is on building rapport and on trying to use some of the psychological principles we've talked about to enhance their memory recall. So in the peace approach, you kind of flip things. So you start with the assumption that the person is innocent, and you want to give them whatever opportunity they can to prove that innocence. And usually the way they can do that is by remembering as much detail as they possibly can about what actually happened whenever the crime occurred, basically. So I'll tell you one of the best ways to actually tell if someone is lying or not is the level of detail that they put into their story. So someone who's lying often will start with something very vague because coming up with a lie is work, right? It's very hard for your brain to imagine something that never happened compared to remembering something that actually did happen. So if you're trying to tell that someone's lying, one tell, it's not like a perfect thing, but one thing you can look for is how much detail are they including. So the peace approach tries to focus on helping the individual come up with whatever details they can about what they remember. So they start by assuming they're innocent. They put a lot of preparation into building up rapport, so trying to build kind of some trust between the suspect and the interrogator or the interviewer. They don't even call it an interrogation, they call it an interview. So even like the way that they talk about it is a lot less aggressive compared to how we do here, I guess. So they focus on that first. Then they start by just asking really broad, open-ended questions, and they give the suspect as much time as they need to tell their side of the story without interrupting them, without cutting them off, without trying to stop them whenever they're saying they didn't do it. And then they go back and they ask them sort of probing questions to try to get more details. So, maybe the suspect says, okay, on the night of that murder, I went to the grocery store, and then I went to a restaurant with my friend, and then I went home and went to sleep. And that's kind of their starting story. Then the interviewer might say, okay, you went to the grocery store, what did you buy while you were there? Which grocery store was it? Do you remember what you were wearing? Do you remember if the grocery store was like cold or hot? Were they playing music? So try to ask like details about their actual experience of that event. The more details they can give you, the more likely it is they're telling the truth. And then those details might even help, right? They might suddenly remember, oh, I remember I ran into my friend while I was at the grocery store. Well, now you have a witness you can go and talk to, and you can verify their alibi and make sure that what they're saying is true, right? And maybe they wouldn't have remembered that detail if you were interrogating them and trying to get them to confess to a crime that they didn't actually commit. So just a very different approach to interrogating a suspect. And again, this is another area where they've done research in laboratory settings. So people have, one of the ways they do this, at Iowa State where I went, there was actually a lab that did a lot of this kind of research. And they would bring in students as their participants, and they would pretend that the task they were supposed to do was some kind of test. So maybe they have a math test or a trivia test or something they're supposed to be doing. And there would be a Confederate who's also pretending to do the same test and would try to get the participant to cheat. So they would ask them to share answers, or they would maybe show that, oh, I have the answers to this test or whatever, I'm gonna give it to you. And they would see who cheats and who doesn't. And then they would use one of these two techniques to interrogate that student to try to see if they cheated or not. For the ones who didn't cheat, they're trying to see, can they get a false confession? For the ones who did cheat, they're trying to see, can they get them to tell the truth? And what they find in those kinds of studies, Reid technique often leads to false confessions. The Peace approach does not lead to false confessions and is more likely to get real confessions and to get more details and more information about what actually happened. Okay. So, any questions about interrogation techniques? Or anything else we've covered so far? All right, so social psychology studies a lot of different things, has made a lot of important findings, but also has some pretty severe issues that have kind of been ongoing for the past decade or so maybe. So kind of the biggest issue is something called the replication crisis. To understand this, you kind of got to understand a little bit about how all this research I've been talking about, logistically, how it's done kind of behind the scenes. So a lot of this research gets published in these really prestigious academic journals. Most professors at big universities, their primary job is to do research, and teaching is kind of a side gig for them. It's very different from how it is here. You're I don't do any research, I just focus on teaching. But at universities, that's flipped, right? So in order for most professors at those big universities to get promotions, to get raises, they have to produce research. They have to publish in these journals. So they're motivated to try to get stuff into these journals as much as possible. Ideally, if the research they're doing is good and sound and valid, then people should be able to replicate that. So if I did a study like any of the studies I've described today, and I find whatever I find, if I did that study really well, then someone else should be able to read my paper, do that exact same study in their own university, and ideally should find the same thing, right? Does that make sense so far? So replication crisis refers to the fact that in social psychology, that's often not the case. That a lot of the studies that get published in these big journals, other labs go and try to replicate what those studies found, and they can't replicate the same results. They end up finding something completely different. from what the original researchers found. So that's a problem, because that tells us that maybe some of that original research wasn't done it wasn't done correctly. There was some sort of error that was made. There's some kind of issue with whatever the finding is if other people can't find the same thing. So this replication crisis is prominent in a lot of fields. It's in a lot of psychology. It's also in things like chemistry and physics and biology. Pretty much any area that does research, there are often studies that get published that can't be replicated. But in social psychology, it's much more prominent than a lot of other fields, to the point that some people say social psychology is a crisis. It needs to make massive changes to the way that it does things. And there's a few reasons why that might be the case. So one is just the fact that in social psychology, by its nature, we're studying people and how they interact with groups, and there's a huge amount of variability in there, right? If I'm a chemist and I'm studying, I don't know anything about chemistry, so you guys can laugh at me because I have no idea what I'm talking about, but if I'm a chemist and I'm studying how sodium interacts with whatever, some other element, that sodium is going to be the same from one atom to the other for the most part, right? The other element's going to be the same from one atom to the other, and so there's some variability in the way I do things, but those chemicals are going to be the same from chemical to chemical, right? Whereas people are extremely different. Every single person in this room is very different from each other person. And when you start looking at big groups of people, you have all this variability, right? So if I do a study here at LCC, and I find whatever results about all of you, and then I try to do that exact same study somewhere else, at Iowa State University where I went, I might find different results, but that might just be because the people are very different from one place to another. Right? So maybe it's nothing wrong with the original study. Maybe there's just a lot of variability and we need to take that into account. Another issue is what's called publication bias. So let's say I want to do a study, let's say I want to do the video game study I was talking about before. I'm going to test, I'm going to bring in some people to have them play Call of Duty. I'm going to bring in some other people to have them play Animal Crossing or whatever. And we're going to see what their violent behaviors are after that, right? Let's say I do that study 100 times. Out of that 100 times, just by chance, statistically, one of those studies is going to find something interesting. Okay? And that interesting thing might just be some weird coincidence of that particular one time that I did it. And all the other 99 times I do that study might be completely different. But if I'm a professor and I'm trying to get promotion, then I'm going to send in that one study that had the very interesting thing, because that's more likely to get published than the 99 that didn't show anything interesting, right? So those 99 I'm just going to tuck away in a drawer, pretend they never happened. I'm going to send off the one good one, and that's going to get published. So then all the stuff that ends up in these journals have this huge bias that we're only publishing the good stuff, and all the bad stuff gets buried away. Okay? So then, of course, if someone else tries to replicate that, it's more likely their study's going to turn out like the 99 instead of the one that got published. Even more insidious, there are lots of cases in social psychology of people falsifying data completely. So there was one very huge example of this. Let me find the guy's name because I always forget it. It's Diederik Stapel. I want to say yes. So Diederik Stapel, he was a professor in the Netherlands, and he did a lot of research in social psychology. Some of his studies, he did one where they're all kind of silly on the face of it if you think about it. He did one where he had participants come into a lab. Some of them watched videos of young people doing active things, and some of them watched videos of old people just sitting around playing checkers or something. And then he watched the way that they walked as they left the room, and he found that the ones who had watched the young people being very active, they had this bounce in their step, they walked faster down the hallway. The ones who had watched the old people were very slow and kind of walked differently, right? So he came up with this whole theory about how we, all our behaviors are based on priming from what we see or from the people around us. He published a bunch of studies that had kind of the same logic but looked at different behaviors. He also published a study that said that people, carnivores, people who eat meat, are more selfish than vegetarians. So he had found that through some sort of survey research or something. It turned out that he was falsifying all of his data, which means he was just making it all up. So he would actually do the studies to try to cover his tracks. He would have people come in, do whatever the silly experiment was, but then he would get on his Excel spreadsheet, and instead of putting in the actual numbers of what people did, he just made up numbers that fit whatever his hypothesis was that he was trying to test. Let's see, I have numbers. There were 58 articles of his that were retracted because they were all found to have at least some falsified data in it. And those spanned all the way from 1996 to 2011. So something that definitely happens. There's been other cases within the field of social psychology. None of them are quite as like egregious as him, but there's been other cases that are kind of similar, just like a smaller scale. So if you're making up your data, obviously no one's going to be able to replicate it if they try to actually do the study legitimately. So like in other fields, people could do the same thing. There's maybe less oversight than you would imagine for a lot of research. If you get into like medical research, tons of oversight. For pretty much anything outside of medical research, there's not a lot of oversight of what's happening. Like when I was doing research as a grad student, I pretty much did whatever I wanted. People just trusted me to like be honest. Nobody was ever checking my work really. And that's very common in a lot of places that graduate students and professors are just kind of doing their own thing without a lot of oversight. So, you could have the same problem in cognitive psychology and other areas, but there's something about social psychology that tends to be more like, it has more prestige than other fields. It's kind of like the sexy psychology is the best way I can describe it, which I know sounds like bizarre to all of you who aren't immersed in this area, but it's true. So social psychologists sometimes take on this like rock star persona. So you get social psychologists who are almost like celebrities within their field, and they're kind of treated that way. So it leads to like a certain personality type that ends up in social psychology. People who have very big egos, who have a lot of like desire to protect their image. And so you end up with a lot more of people who are willing to falsify data to try to make themselves look like this big rock star researcher. Whereas, cognitive psychologists, we tend to be a little bit more like nerdy, a little less of like that outgoing rock star kind of figure, I guess. And then the last thing that probably contributes a lot to this is that social psychology results are impacted a lot by participants' knowledge. So oftentimes, students are the participants in a lot of studies. So the way that most of these studies are done at universities is they have to have these participants, right? I keep saying they bring in 100 participants to do whatever, and I don't know if you've ever thought, like, where do those 100 participants come from? Almost all of them are psychology undergraduate students. So when I went to Iowa State as an undergraduate, it was required in a lot of my classes, like if I took an intro psych class like this at Iowa State, I would be required to participate in studies that are done by other professors as part of my grade. So most of the participants in these studies are students in psychology who are learning about the stuff that the study's about, right? So if you were a participant in like one of the studies I've described, like the bystander effect one, right? Let's say you happen to sign up for that study as a student and you see that, okay, they're making me do whatever and I'm walking by this person who's like needing help on the sidewalk. You might very quickly figure out, if you've learned about the bystander effect in your psychology course, you might figure out, oh, I know what this study's about and I don't want to look like a bad person, so I'm going to stop and help this person even though I know I'm in a group, right? So just knowing about the study and what its results are might actually change your behavior. So part of the issue too is that every time we teach about a study in a class, we're making it harder for people to replicate that study because now they're not working with naive participants anymore. They're working with people who know what the study's about. Does that make sense? So then that can change the results as well. So I would say what you should take from that is that, social psychology, very important research, lots of stuff, especially like with the criminal justice system stuff, that's really important research that needs to be done. But there is a lot of issues within the field as a whole. There are people trying to make changes. So one of the big things they're doing is trying to change the process of getting stuff published. So they're now making it where a lot of journals will hear what your idea is first. You'll tell them what the setup of the study is before you've collected any data or anything. You tell them, I want to do a study on the bystander effect. I'm going to have my participants do X and Y or whatever. And they approve the study right then. They say, okay, if you do this study, you do it well, we're going to publish it. We don't care what the results are. So whether you find interesting results or not, we're still going to publish this because we've determined that your method is sound. So then that helps things, right? Because then you get rid of a lot of that publication bias issue. There's also a push for people to make their data openly available, So there's ways that if someone has falsified data, there's like statistical analyses we can do to figure out how likely it is that it's been made up versus how likely it is that it's real. So if people put their data out there for other people to see, then you also get rid of that falsified data issue. So people are trying to make changes. Hopefully it's enough to